Well, Dr. Ndi Onuekwusi joins us this morning. He's a development consultant to focus on some of those issues raised there in that meeting. How significant is the visit by the UN scribe for you to the country?
Well, the visit of the UN Secretary General is always a significant occasion for its advocacy component, particularly because he is the #1 civil servant of the whole world. However, for developing countries like Nigeria, we need to put this in proper perspective. And that is not to lose sight of where we are in development and where we need to be, where we ought to be, have been by now, and where we are going to, and how we can do that. So the point I'd like to make is that externalities to any polity are totally inconsequential to the development of that polity. So countries have been known to withdraw themselves into an enclave and develop and emerge. So we need to be clear on our path to development.
Dr. Onuekwusi, we're talking about where we are, where we should be going, and where we ought to be. Let's start from where we are.
Well, by way of introduction, so that we are on the same page. What we call development generally has three distinct components. One is growth, that you moved from 1 trillion to 3 trillion is growth. The second is development, that you had a transformation of mode, that you stop farming with hoes and knives to tractors and plows. And the third is progress. That means that there is a value proposition, a positive value proposition in the course of your movement in these three phases. Now, the positive value proposition is the single most important aspect of what is generally called development. And in our own development from the war period, our first leaders, Awolowo, Ahmadu Bello, and Opara in the three regions, had tremendous balance for development. And if that trajectory had continued, by now we would be competing with India and China. Unfortunately, with the disruptions of the war and the degeneration of society, we went and lost totally the value proposition component of development, which means that you do things properly. When Marina turned from bungalows to high-rises, of course, before then there was growth in bulk of capital. But then there was development, because there's a transformation of mode to high-rise. But people were using Marina as toilets. So there was failure in value proposition. So as we have advanced since then till now, and grown in corruption, and grown in lack of the human capital component of development that makes a person as a developed person, okay? We have degenerated rather than developed, even though the numbers would show that there has been an increase. But that is an increase that is counterproductive and destructive to society.
Sorry, Chamberlain, because that increase is also evident in the amount of states we have seen. Yeah. If you take us back to how you started by telling us about the regions, now talking about regional development, we had from 3 regions, and we saw how it evolved into what we have now. Yeah. How can you say that has impacted? Because some would have thought that such kind of development has taken us to where we are at the moment with 36 states and the FCT.
The difficulty that Nigeria has suffered with restructuring is also inherent in the failure of a national strategic vision, which would have determined the necessary structural system for development. It's like if we go to the MDGs and things we're talking about now. The MDGs are not anything to shout home about. The MDGs were just indicators and goals that come out when you develop, end poverty and hunger, have quality education. Unfortunately for us in Nigeria, like we distort everything. It was supposed to be an advocacy platform for helping leaders. Here we transmuted it into platforms of operational structures. So we now started having MDG offices running projects. It wasn't supposed to be so. And so they became channels for graft and for waste. So the critical thing in our development where we are now is to take a deep breath. 3 deep breaths, 10 deep breaths. That is what they teach in managing psychology. Okay? Having taken those deep breaths, we should then say, this is the Nigeria that we want to have in the future. Let's say Nigeria, a great democratic country that is under the rule of law with full employment.
Let me bring
then based on that, let me just finish answering his question. Then based on that, we would say, what are the failures of where we are now? The greatest failure of where we are now is that there is no governance at point of service and at community level. You just say a governor that was talking about his state, and he is worrying about how to create employment. The government doesn't really create employment. Government creates the enabling environment for employment opportunities to expand. Because if you look at the history of development itself, which is right from the beginning of creation, it is the critical issue here is that it is the individual human capital, the release of the individual human potential that actually propels development.
You know, you spoke about how certain things happened, then after the war, many of them were truncated, or during the war. But ever since then, we had different governments talk about rolling plans, which they also refer to as development plans. So to what extent did we get it wrong? Because they, from that perspective, all of those plans was meant to bring us back on course.
Well, like that is now going to the key issue, the human capital component of development. If you take, no matter the example you take, if you take China, for instance, okay, which is a modern development that all of us can talk about. If I go back to America, it will be a different system. But we can touch on that because there are the 2 variants, major variants driving the world at the moment. Mao took the Chinese into, the human capital component, that is the progress, okay? First of all, grabs your spirit. Okay, where you can look at the brick and mortar development as flesh. But it is the spirit that drives every other thing. So in developing the proper human capital component, that is getting into the brain box of your people to target on development, then we will move forward. But in Nigeria, we lost it with the war, and then we started imbibing consumption psychology. So who can have the bigger car? Who can have the bigger house? Whereas we were a poor people who should have significant discipline. Look at India. That's how they're able to rise. You know, you have to lie low as people, not exhibiting wealth, a lot of which is stolen, okay, as the basis of your societal values. Okay? It has to be production and not consumption. Okay? So that at the point you are consuming based on passive earning. But if you are consuming primary earning, you will die poor. And that is what is happening to us in general. So we need to get knowledgeable people. We now have a wonderful president who is serious, around whom we can build a new mantra, psychology, and vision, structures, strategies, and values to move to the right place. And it will take 10 years.